This week's installment focuses on the all but forgotten Catholic land movement. Think of it as an alternative to the Benedict option. The Catholic land movement was promoted by the late Father Vincent McNabb, who was a close associate of Hilaire Belloc and G.K. Chesterton, who all sought a third way of economics that supported the family and resisted the scourges of modernity and modernism. McNabb was a champion of the simpler, more honest life offered by living off of the land. As always, thank you for subscribing, and thank you to the patrons who make this work possible. Have a blessed Sunday. The Catholic Land Movement by Father Vincent McNabb. Out of Egypt have I called my son. In any case we clearly see, and on this there is general agreement, that some opportune remedy must be found quickly for the misery and wretchedness pressing so unjustly on the majority of the working class. The law, therefore, should favor ownership, and its policy should be to induce as many as possible of the humbler classes to become owners. Many excellent results will follow from this, and first of all, property will certainly become more equitably divided, for the result of civil change and revolution has been to divide society into two widely different castes. On the one side, there is the party which holds power because it holds wealth, which has in its grasp the whole of labor and trade, which manipulates for its own benefit and for its own purposes all the sources of supply, and which is even represented in the councils of the state itself. On the other side, there is the needy and powerless multitude, broken down and suffering, and ever ready for disturbance. If working people can be encouraged to look forward to obtaining a share in the land, that the consequences will be that the gulf between vast wealth and sheer poverty will be bridged over, and the respective classes will be brought nearer to one another. A further consequence will result in the greater abundance of the fruits of the earth. Men always work harder on what belongs to them. Nay, they learn to love the very soil that yields, in response to the labor of their lands, not only food to eat, but an abundance of good things for themselves and those that are dear to them. That such a spirit of willing labor would add to the produce of the earth and to the wealth of the community is self-evident. And a third advantage would spring from this. Men would cling to the country in which they were born, for no one would exchange their country for foreign land if his own afforded him the means of living a decent and happy life. As an aside, Father McNabb opened his essay with direct references to Rerum Novarum, which I presented some weeks ago on a Sunday upload. Returning to the document. The challenge of these inspired words of Holy Scripture and authoritative words of a papal encyclical has led the Catholics of these lands to begin a movement out of towns and back to the country. Not that the challenge of itself led immediately to the present movement. There have been 40 years of social wanderings since Pope Leo called the need of a remedy urgent. When his challenge was first sounded, quoting again, some minds were not a little disturbed, with the result that the noble and exalted teachings of Leo XIII, quite novel to worldly ears, was looked upon with suspicion by some even among Catholics, and gave offense to others, for boldly attacked and overthrew the idols of liberalism, swept away inveterate prejudices, and was so far and so unexpectedly in advance of its time that the slow of heart ridiculed the study of the new social philosophy, and the timid feared to scale its lofty heights. Nor were there wanting those who, while professing their admiration of this message of light, regarded it as a utopian ideal, desirable rather than attainable in practice. As an aside, that is a citation by Father McNabb of Pope Pius XI's Quadragesimo Anno. The group of Catholics, priests, and layfolk who are beginning an exodus from the famine to the possibility of ownership have, in fact, yielded to authority only as brought home by circumstances directly observable by facts. They have finally moved to act and to react not merely or mainly by the challenge from Rome, but from the cry from the penury and sin of Glasgow, Birmingham, and London. In conviction, if not in words, they have anticipated the following words of the Holy Father. After modern machinery and modern industry had progressed with astonishing speed and taken possession of many newly colonized countries, no less than of the ancient civilizations of the Far East, the number of the dispossessed laboring masses, whose groans mount to heaven from these lands, increased beyond all measure. Moreover, there is the immense army of hired rural laborers, whose condition is depressed in the extreme and who have no hope of ever obtaining a share in the land. These two, unless efficacious remedies be applied, will remain perpetually sunk in their present conditions. Again, Father McNabb is quoting Quadragesimo Anno. Let us then set down in order some of the main motives that had led these Catholics to see, in obedience to the Holy Father, in this particular matter, not only a generally right and desirable thing for Christendom to do, but the best and most urgent thing for themselves to do here in Great Britain and at the present time. First principal motive, to worship God. Like the chosen people, they are minded to leave the flesh pots of Egypt, not for the milk and honey of the promised land, but that the people may go and worship God. They wish to put first things first, their law, or rule, like the law of the people of God begins. I am the Lord thy God, that brought thee out of the land of Egypt, and out of the house of bondage. Thou shalt not have strange gods before me. Not only will they not worship by desire what is wrong, like Mammon, but they will not desire as a primary good what is only a secondary good. Thus they will leave the ugliness of the town, not for the beauty of the land, but for the beauty of God's face. They will fly from the disease of the town, not for the health of the body, but for the health of the soul. They will cut the tangled complexity of town life, not for the simple life with nature, but for the quiet life with God. Second motive, to follow Christ. Moreover, as a greater than Moses has, by his death on the cross, led them out of a greater bondage than that of Egypt, the God whom they worship and would follow is he whose name was written on the cross as Jesus of Nazareth. Now Jesus of Nazareth, the Word made flesh, did not come into our midst to show flesh and blood an example, but to be its Redeemer. Man's power of willing what he knew had always been so much less than his power of knowing what to will, that what he needed most was not leadership or even example making a plain way still plainer, but redemption, making his weak human will stronger. Now, what must be said of the human race in the days before the coming of Jesus must be said today. If we may believe two popes who have written about social matters, mankind was done wrong so effectively that social good has to be not only stored, but restored. An evil or a mistaken past must now be redeemed at a great price, but only the weights and measures of Nazareth will give individuals and nations the ownership and sovereignty of their own souls. The modern world needs redemption, and redemption means a return to Nazareth. It is for this reason that over the lintel of every home and homestead we would build on the land might well be cut in stone. And he went down with them and came to Nazareth, and was subject to them. Third motive, family love. One of the most explicit motives of those who are turning their faces towards the land is the desire to restore the Catholic family. Most of the older men and women who can themselves remember parents and grandparents know that the modern arrangement of the world has put an end to the historic institution called home. Many of the younger men and women, too, realize as if by intuition that a state of things that makes race suicide seem to be the only practical policy is only a state of chaos, if indeed it can be called a state. The splendid vision of wedded love, granted by God to the heart of youth, seems but divine mockery when met by town conditions, which make the begetting of a family seem a crime against the state. It is to the credit of our sober days that amongst the most sober fugitives from that proximate occasion of sin called the modern town are to be found young men and women whose heart is stirring with the self-sacrificial desires of wedlock and parenthood. It is in these aspirants to wedded vows that poor prodigal man turns from the squalor of a stile and the company of swine to a home furnished and adorned with husband and wife, parent and child. In that holy place of human love, room and need will be found for the parent. Now become the grandfather or grandmother. How ill-organized is a world that has no other place than an institution, a workhouse for the wisdom of the old. But what a school of human and divine love, and therefore of wisdom that springs from love, is a home made possible and safe by the homestead. Modern seekers after the true method of education will seek in vain until they recognize the wisdom in the phrase once uttered by a woman of the crowd. I had nothing but homeschooling. Yet the homeschooling now almost absent from town life is so fundamental that, in another phrase of a priest of God, political economy is the child of domestic economy. This only says, in the language of the schools, that God has made the family to be the unit and model of the state, and that the greatest praise of sovereign power is to call the wielder of that power the father of his people. Fourth motive, love of chastity. This family life, with its craft of love, leads to another mode of driving Catholic men and women out of city life to the land. Everywhere around them are the sight and reek of bodily sin. These men and women are beginning to burn with shame at the insult offered to them. If they are men, they feel the insult of being considered so sensual that even a food or a holiday haunt cannot be offered to them without the recommendation of some sensual nudity. If they are women, in an age of self-consciousness, they feel even more insulted by the suggestion that women's chief interest for man is not spiritual or intellectual, but carnal. Town life, with its daily herding together and dwellings and modes of transport, is tending to produce a sensual disease which only isolation will cure or prevent. Psychologists of the mob, and a modern town is hardly more than a mob, will recognize that no moral disease is so contagious and persistent as that which is based on the bodily pleasure accompanying the altruism of parenthood. Too often has mob psychology studied merely the wild outbursts of a crowd in anger, forgetful that, though thou shalt not kill is a more fundamental commandment than thou shalt not commit adultery, yet taking life is in itself so mentally abhorrent and creating life is so physically pleasurable that when men and women are herded together in our modern towns, sexual uncontrol tends to spread like a social plague. To flee that sensual plague, Catholic men and women are going out of the crowded town to the wide spaces of the countryside, where the infection of sin within them will not be in the fittest medium for its growth and spread. Fifth motive, love of justice. Another motive behind the Catholic land crusaders is the ideal embodied in the Redeemer's first reveille. Blessed are the poor, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Yet that reveille does not awaken the ideal of a starving poverty that is hardly permitted to give or even to live. On the contrary, it is the heroic and socially valuable poverty of him who was poor yet enriching many. Return to land work and its twin fellow handwork means the return to a stable, profitable state of things, where the worker lives over his work and deals directly with the things made by infinite wisdom and love. When man has made this return, not to things primitive, but to things primary, man need not waste a moment of time or an ounce of material. In other words, return to land work and handwork gives all men the chance, and unselfish men the inducement, to the ideal. Poverty of work and production. Poverty of thrift and consumption. These are the two kinds of poverty linked with the two primary functions of production and consumption. By poverty of work, a man seeks to produce as much as possible of real, as distinct from token wealth. His ideal will be to produce the most he can of the best he can. St. Paul's challenge to the discussion-loving Ephesians will seldom fail from his thoughts. He that stole, let him steal no more, but rather let him toil, working with his hands the thing that is good, that he may have wherewith to give to the needy. Such a worker will have all the more to give if after he has produced as much as he consumes as little as he needs. Poverty of work joined with poverty of thrift. A land worker or a hand worker who measures his rights by his duties and his wants by his needs will leave the world that welcomed him richer than when it gave him a welcome. Set against this enriching poverty of land work and handwork, the machine work of the town is seen to be essentially wasteful of time and material. When then the Catholic land crusaders plan to leave the town, it is not merely through a desire to worship God and keep the hard command, thou shalt not commit adultery, but it is a desire to fulfill, thou shalt not steal. Sixth motive, love of liberty. A further motive of urgency with the Catholic land crusaders may be called their love of liberty. To some of them, this motive expresses itself as a principle. The home is the social defense of liberty, and the homestead is the economic defense of the home. Yet this liberty is not a man's physical and moral power to do what he would, but to do what he ought. The half-truth and therefore heresy of self-expression takes no lasting root on the land. But only on the land, with its easy direct access to the forces of nature, is there the normal possibility of that unselfish self-reproduction which is nature's counterstroke to self-expression. On the land, therefore, the father of a family, which is the divine unit of human society, can seek liberty without himself falling into any antisocial selfishness. His demand to be free from servile conditions is a demand to have no hindrance to the good use of his power to beget and rear a family. Put briefly, the ideal of liberty appears thus to the young men and women of the land crusade. They think that human love, being a divine instinct, lives only by the making and the keeping of promises or vows. Now every vow is made a duty forged. For wedded love, the mutual promise of the husband and wife, and the promise, all the more sacred because not mutual, of the father and mother towards the child, forge a chain of duty which demands the utmost freedom from all let or hindrance. And the youth who are now looking for the liberty to worship God by family life are turning from the servile conditions of the modern town as man has made it to the free conditions of nature made by God. Seventh motive, love of the fatherland. Lastly, the men and women who are preparing to quit the towns for the land of their native country are prompted by the love of their country. They recognize that no town feeds or clothes itself, but must necessarily be fed and clothed by the dwellers on the land. Moreover, they go on to recognize that the more people dwell in the town, the more people must dwell on and till the land. Hence, a state so organized that town dwellers increase and land dwellers decrease is a state bleeding to death. But no other country in the world has our excess of town dwellers over land dwellers. The results of this ill-made distribution of our people are set out with startling clearness by the Prime Minister, Mr. Ramsay MacDonald, in a recent utterance on the national crisis. Quoting the Prime Minister, "It is essential that the confidence of the world in our credit should be restored. Otherwise we shall not be able to maintain the value of the pound sterling, and the results of that should be very carefully considered. First of all, if there was any collapse of the pound, we should be defaulting in our obligations to the rest of the world, and our credit would be gone. This would be fatal, since this country, above all others, depends on the maintenance of its credit, having to buy, as we do, so large a part of our food and raw materials from abroad. If our financial stability is endangered and a run made on our financial resources, the consequences are too terrible to envisage." End quote. It is sometimes urged that land work is hard. The reply must always be, hard or easy, land work is necessary. If then the nation needs for its life the sacrifice, or as the present writer would say, the seeming sacrifice of land work, this work must be organized, either voluntarily or compulsorily, because a nation, like an individual, cannot take its own life. If voluntary effort fails, the nation will be compelled to apply compulsion. Viens dico. Such compulsion would be a disgrace to any people, especially the people of these islands, to whom God has committed land that is the most fertile and a climate that is the most temperate of his world. But the Catholic land crusaders are determined to prevent this disgrace by making voluntary effort not a failure, but a success. Filled with a hope and love that springs from their high vision of faith, they are tided to go forth from Egypt's servile conditions to the liberty of the sons and daughters of God, where they may worship him with hand and heart. They will not be forgetful that when God bids them worship him by the commandment, "Honor thy father and thy mother," he has bid them to give honor, reverence, obedience, and, at times, self-sacrifice to the land that bore them, and the breasts of earth that gave them suck. Prepare thy work without, and diligently till thy ground, that afterwards thou mayest build thy house.